Yeah, one right-wing party beat another right-wing party. Not much has changed.
That's the summary. We've, of course, left a lot of tantalising threads here unpulled, but never fear, we will be tugging on them for... for many weeks yet.
Get ready for some tugging.
Mutual, la, mutual, la. This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
Residents across Victoria and South Australia are being urged to remain vigilant as extreme fire conditions threaten both states.
Downgraded and lost a cyclone status. 100km/h winds have torn roofs off homes and intense rainfall has swamped the region.
These are tough times, but Australians are tough people.
You are listening to the Radio Reversal podcast. As always, or at least most of the time, we are recording this episode on the unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people here in Meganjin, so-called Brisbane. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and to all First Nations communities who live across this continent. We know that sovereignty over these lands has never been ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and we do our best to ground all of the conversations that we're having about these seemingly diverse and expansive topics in the material reality of Indigenous peoples' continuing sovereignty over these lands, and to think about what that means in the context of all of the political questions that come up in the present. So that's a particularly important acknowledgement to make in the context of this week's episode.
Yeah.
I'm Anna, and I'm bringing you this episode with Jono. Jono, how are you going?
I'm doing good. Very excited to be talking about the federal election, what it means, what do we make of it all, what happened. Let's jump into it, hey?
We've got heaps to go on this week's show, and we're kind of loosely following some of the themes and questions that we've been digging into in this little series we've been doing on crisis, disaster, and possible futures. What it means to think about the election in the context of the polycrisis, in the context of disaster on every horizon, of continuing genocide and settler colonial violence in Palestine, in Kanaki, in West Papua, in so-called Australia, in the context of, mass incarceration and police violence, the continuing incarceration of refugees, folks seeking asylum. What does it mean to think about the federal election in this kind of political context?
Yeah.
And I guess in a kind of explicitly big political sense, not just in the kind of technocratic sense of on which elections are usually discussed. So,
and going a bit beyond, yay, Australia rejected Trumpism.
100%, which I think is one of our primary interests in doing these shows, other than just, being nerds who think a lot about what's happening, is also in really wanting to get kind of underneath some of the mainstream stories that are being told about this election. And that's we want to start in this episode is thinking more deeply about what is and isn't being talked about in this election, the stories that are being foregrounded and the stories that are being erased, and what we can learn from that. So this is another episode of the Radio Reversal podcast. As always, please, if you haven't already, head over to subscribe. You can find us at radioreversal.substack. Soon to be migrating to a new platform. Stay tuned for that. But if you subscribe now, then we'll migrate you seamlessly to the new platform, and it'll all be so very easy. Here's the show. My name's Anna. I am so excited to be bringing you this week's episode. I'm in the studio with Jono. How are you, Jono?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to be back.
Jono, what can people expect from this week's show? Yeah,
so there's so much to unpack. We'll start with a little bit of an overview of the results, and then jump into what we think this means in terms of the national political landscape. We want to talk a little bit about what we can learn from the Greens not doing so well, and I'm interested in the fact that they actually ran a pretty kind of safe, you might almost say conservative campaign, and then were still attacked for being extremists. So we'll unpack that a little bit, and we'll talk about what this means going forwards and the importance of embracing grassroots radical activism on the streets.
Absolutely. Later in the show, we're going to be catching up with some of the organisers who are on the ground right now over in Musgrave Park, who've been working to support folks who are sleeping rough, who have this morning faced eviction and the destruction of their property, which is a pretty horrific thing to be witnessing in the midst midst of a housing crisis, in the aftermath of this apparent progressive victory, which anyway, we're going to debunk that particular narrative later. But later in the show, we are going to be catching up with one of the organisers who's been on the ground this morning, who's going to give us a bit of an update about what happened down there this morning, how folks are going, and how anyone who hasn't already been down or isn't already planning to head down, how we can be better in support.
All right. Broad overview of what's happened. The federal election's done. Counting of the last votes is still going on in a few tight seats, but the broad trend is clear. Averaged out across the nation, we have a moderate swing from the Liberals to Labor, a slight swing towards independents, and a slight drop in the Greens vote. So that's what happened on average across the country. The Liberals only lost about 3.5%, and Labor gained 2.2% of the vote. That's not actually a huge change.
Yeah, it's
overall.
pretty minor, right?
But similar to last election, roughly a third of voters gave Labor their first preference, a third voted one for the Liberals, and a third voted one for someone other than the two major parties. But within some specific seats, the swings were a bit bigger, so those changes have had really major impacts. Labor has won at least 13 seats off the Liberals, at least, still counting, while the Liberals have actually also won back the seat of Goldstein from independent Zoe Daniel. Interestingly, former Nationals MP Andrew Gee, who quit the Nationals due to their opposition to the Indigenous voice to Parliament, he's retained his seat as an independent, while Labor has won at least 3 seats off the Greens, including Greens leader Adam Bandt's seat of Melbourne. So, yeah, shocking result for Peter Dutton, which we're all thrilled about, but it's also pretty bad for the Greens. The main reason they've lost lower house seats is that the Liberals did so badly that they dropped to third place in key contests, and then Liberal preferences have mostly flowed to Labor candidates to help Labor beat the Greens. But apart from that, the Greens also suffered a slight swing back to Labor. So we're going to dive into that soon too. But yeah, I guess firstly we wanted to think about what some other important people are saying about this election, and I guess the broad theme here, or the thing we're trying to highlight, is that Labor is a right-wing party, and not much is going to change without bottom-up pressure. So
absolutely, and I think one of the things that has been infuriating, and this we're very lucky, our dear friend and comrade, the wonderful Mununjahli and South Sea Islander scholar and writer Chelsea Watego has been producing this great little mini-series on Instagram and TikTok called Let's Talk Race on the Run, and Chelsea shared some of her initial reflections on the election immediately afterwards, which we're going to be able to play as a little clip. But one of the sort of general preoccupations, I think, in a lot of the initial analysis that's coming out of particularly like First Nations communities, but also Palestinian solidarity movements and folks who are less convinced by the narrative that Labor is the, quote, more progressive choice.
Climate activists, refugee rights activists.
Exactly. Yeah. Everyone good. Is that this narrative that this is a progressive victory really fails to acknowledge the reality that what has actually happened is that Labor has just moved into the space that used to be occupied by the so-called slightly more moderate elements of the LNP.
Labor has won Liberal voters by being
being more like the Liberal Party, right? And this is crucial, and this is the conversation we're going to have later in the show about the difference between like meaningful structural transformation of people's position, people's politics, their beliefs, their deep core values and understandings of the world versus changing how people vote.
Yeah.
And I think there's something really important there about, for the Greens, for minor parties, for independent candidates in general, that it is a different thing to change how people vote than it is to change how people think. And sometimes we conflate those two things too quickly.
We think that in a given election cycle, a whole bunch of more people voted Greens, therefore they're all now on board with everything the Greens are calling for, or indeed everything that people who are more radical and transformationally oriented than the Greens are calling for. But
absolutely, and
that's
I think
not necessarily the case. Yeah.
As a kind of personal aside, I think something that I notice a lot is that I guess people who are involved in either party politics or community politics, right, in movement-based work, in community organising, tend to be people who think really deeply about politics. So we tend to be people who are thinking deeply about our political choices. And so I think sometimes that means that when we think about what it means to change who you vote for, we give a lot of gravity to that. We're like, this is quite a grave,
it's considered
political decision. And I think that misses the fact that for a lot of people, perhaps very correctly, it does not feel like that, right?
Yeah.
Voting does not feel like
You and I were both handing out at booths on election day, handing out for the Greens for our friend Rima Naji, who's
the
an amazing
wonderful Rima, yep.
Palestinian woman who ran on the south side of Brizzy. But yeah, we both experienced that, and it's nothing new, but it's just like a lot of people don't put much thought into it and don't really know why they're voting for someone or...
voting is a kind of... I know a colleague, Jess, was writing about this earlier this week, that... it's a kind of performative act.
Yeah, it's experienced as a chore.
Exactly. It's experienced either as a chore, as a kind of performance or a ritual, but not necessarily for a lot of people as a sort of gravely significant political decision. And so I think the significance of that when we're thinking about these kind of outcomes and people kind of shifting their votes and whatever, is just to not presume that people changing their votes means that the kind of deep political transformation has necessarily happened. That means that they won't just change their votes again in the future.
And I mean, I think you should queue up this chat from Chelsea, but like we had a big Queensland election just last year where the Liberals had a large swing towards them, and those same people have swung back to Labor very quickly.
Yes.
And yeah, I think that really highlights for me that people aren't... We know this already. People aren't rusted on to any particular party, but they can... Even like a month or two ago, Albanese was looking in serious trouble.
Yes.
But as you said, they really watered down the most left-wing aspects of their platform. They barely mentioned climate change. They definitely didn't mention refugee rights. And their messaging on immigration was basically, we're going to be tougher on migrants, kind of adopting Dutton's rhetoric.
Yep.
They just like left out anything that looked even a little bit progressive from their platform, and then just focused on attacking Dutton. And so, one right-wing party beat another right-wing party. Not much has changed. That's
the summary. This is the wonderful Chelsea Watego offering what I think is a really critical perspective, particularly for others listening who, like us, are settlers here in this still colonised context. To think, I guess, more deeply about what it means to think in terms even of left and right in the context of a continuing colonial project that does in fact rely on both. I prefer the terms repressive and reformist rather than left and right necessarily to describe the current political projects on offer. But I think there's a kind of there is something really vital about starting from this place of saying actually all of these political projects are deeply implicated in maintaining settler colonialism in this context, and that the moments at which we see political possibilities that challenge settler colonialism directly, they are swiftly ostracised.
Okay, let's talk race on the run and last night's election result. Don't get me wrong, I am relieved, I guess, that we're not waking up to Dutton as PM, and the LNP leadership did bring me joy to see Clive Palmer get no seats. Train wreck was fun to watch last night. The blackfella memes are hilarious. And yeah, look, all Dutton's talk about division, his resounding loss. I don't think I've seen this country this united since Cathy Freeman won gold in the 2000 Olympics. Look, I don't want to spoil the party, but I'm not as excited as all those progressive white women are about a Labor majority government. You might have noticed in Albanese's victory speech last night that he really celebrated the party's position in acknowledging country, though he forgot to do it first. It was part of a jab at the LNP, and I don't know, I thought they got the memo about not using blackfellas as a political football. The other things he had to say about blackfellas during that speech was blah, 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 reconciliation and close the gap. Not what blackfellas want. What Albo failed to make mention of was the Labor Party's position on Palestine. And today we have a nation celebrating how it's risen above the culture wars while failing to make mention of our own government's complicity in a genocide. Labor government ministers have actively silenced academics and artists who dare think and speak about genocide. One thing that they're not courageous, but to come for those who are, a Labor majority actually scares me. The shitty part about this for me is that this isn't a win that blackfellas and Palestinian people can share in. This election result was a win for whiteness. That so-called Australia could redeem its its virtue and innocence post the voice referendum. They're not really racist after all. In a settler colonial state, both the left and the right are the same. In the lead up to the election, Uncle Robbie Thorpe made the point that for blackfellas, choice between the two major parties is a choice between overt racism and covert racism. So yes, you black yes mob need to calm down. This isn't even your moment. In the ABC analysis, I think it was James McGrath talked about, for the LNP, they need to work out how they appeal to the middle centre. And I think that's what worries me as a black fella. This Labor majority was one of appealing to the middle centre. And what we've learned about the middle centre, they don't give a shit about genocide, Indigenous peoples here or elsewhere. This is democracy in a settler colonial state. I don't know what's to celebrate here.
So I thought Chelsea's comments were really good, that point that Labor is pretty awful too. We don't need to spend much time talking about that. But
yeah, we certainly don't need to litigate that point, right?
Yeah, you guys get it. So what we did want to talk about next was the fact that the Greens haven't done great. It's only a slight percentage drop in their overall vote, right? But really what should happen in a context where the Greens hold seats, but they're not in government, and they have the advantage of incumbency, and they've got in Greens MPs have got 3 years to get to know their electorate, etc. Their vote should grow a little bit, but what's happened is that the Greens have lost at least 3 seats, including their federal leader Adam Bant down in Melbourne. So this isn't an exclusively Brisbane thing. It's like there's been a swing against the Greens in some key seats everywhere, and the main reason for that, I think, is that there was a huge negative campaign, a smear campaign run against the Greens, not just in the immediate weeks leading up to the election, but over the past couple of years, a combination of Labor and Liberal attacks getting increasingly vicious and targeted, right-wing minor parties also constructing the Greens as enemy number one, but then big money coming from the fossil fuel industry, from the property industry, from the Zionist lobby, a lot of different interest groups mobilising significant resources to attack and smear the Greens. And I guess the lesson here is that you can't outperform that by using a conventional campaign strategy.
And perhaps you can't outperform it at all. And this is one of the things I've been thinking about a lot, but partly from listening to Chelsea's comments there, but also, I guess, since the election is a comment that Auntie Lilla Watson and Auntie Mary Graham, who are both extraordinary First Nations philosophers and community organisers who've been doing liberatory community-based work for generations now, is this idea of Aboriginal terms of reference. And they talk about this in a bunch of different ways, but one of the things that Auntie Lilla in particular is really focused on is the idea of being like, on whose terms are you playing and on whose terms are you winning?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think there's something really important about, particularly in the context of thinking about the smear campaign, certainly, the corporate lobbying from the development sector in relation to the Greens' positions on housing, the massive lobbying in terms of fossil fuels, very significant. But I do think that the scale of the attacks and the rhetoric of extremism has amplified 20-fold since the Greens have been the only political party to take a meaningful position in solidarity with Palestinians.
Yes. Yeah.
And more notably, to take a position in solidarity with Palestinians that wasn't predicated on strictly a kind of liberal human rights recognition approach, but was in fact predicated on recognising Palestinians' own assertion that this is a settler colonial occupation, and that the invasion of Palestinian land by the Israeli settler colonial state is inherently a colonising project and has to be contested on those terms. And that's really interesting, I think, when we think about the scale of attacks. And I guess I was foreshadowing this earlier, that I think this is what cannot be outperformed in a colony, is like the moment where a political party, even one that's otherwise making these really moderate, liberal, reformist kind of concessions, the moment at which you begin to meaningfully, substantively contest settler colonialism, even abroad, is the point at which you can no longer be palatable.
Yeah, although I guess like what we're really saying is can no longer be tolerated by the political establishment and capital, because what we did see as well in this election was really large swings to the Greens.
I should have been more clear about that. Yes,
in the outer suburbs, right?
Yeah.
So like it looks like there's a big overlap between areas that saw a strong swing to the Greens and areas with high new migrant populations. So, like, the Currabee booth out on Brisbane's south side, which has that suburb of Currabee has almost 30% Muslim population, saw a 22% swing to the Greens. The Greens' primary vote out there in Currabee is almost as high as it is in, like, West End and Paddington now.
Yep.
Like, that is...
Which really challenges, like, a lot of the...
the Greens are not an inner-city
traditional
party. They're winning votes
right?
and that's not just isolated to that one suburb. There are a lot... Even in Zilmere, there was an 8% swing on the north side.
Yep.
Runcorn, there was a 10% swing to the Greens. So these outer suburban areas that have larger working class and new migrant populations swung to the Greens, while upper middle class voters closer to the inner city seem to have swung against the Greens.
Yes.
And I guess what I'm interested in is that, like, I don't actually think when I talk to people about why they weren't voting Greens this time, they didn't raise Palestine as an explicit issue. They didn't say that they disagreed with the Greens' position on Palestine. There was this more general concern that the Greens were too extreme.
Yes.
And the propaganda campaign used Palestine as one of the evidence bases to say the Greens are extreme, they're not concerned about real issues, whatever. But I think the broad objections people had to voting Greens, which were all coming from this smear campaign, were that the Greens were too extreme, that the Greens were obstructionist, and then really that we needed to vote Labor to keep Dutton out because people had still been misinformed about preference voting. But I think what I'm really interested in is that in the campaign itself, the Greens took a very safe, kind of conservative strategy. They ran on a basic social democracy platform, which was like tax big corporations a little bit more, make dental care free. Like, you know, it's hard to point to anything in the actual policy platform that could be described as offensive or extreme. And in fact, Labor was adopting a lot of the Greens' rhetoric. Labor borrowed some of the Greens' policies, like the scrapping Labor wants to cut HEX by 20%. Greens wanted to cut HEX debt by 100%.
Entirely,
it would have been very different. But Labor was able to borrow a lot of the Greens' message and some of their policies in small doses. And that wasn't seen as too extreme or risky for Labor. Similarly, the way Greens MPs and campaigns have conducted themselves over the course of this election was pretty conventional and mainstream. The key seats spent a lot of money on digital advertising, on billboards, on, like, yard signs and printed materials. Like, they did a lot of door knocking, which a few years ago was considered a more novel tactic, but now all the campaigns are doing it. There was nothing I could point to in the Greens campaigns here in Brisbane, at least, that seemed particularly unorthodox or subversive or radical. Like, it was a sort of standard campaign where they used traditional campaign methods to roll out their message. So their message wasn't radical, their methods weren't radical. Like, our candidates were wearing business shirts and, like, laying wreaths at Anzac Day and going along to school awards nights, doing all the things that elected reps are supposed to do, and yet still the strength of the smear campaign was able to position them as extreme. So I think there's a bunch of people online who are saying, the Greens are lost because they were too extreme. The Greens lost because people were convinced to think that the Greens were too extreme. But the reality is that the Greens were not at all taking a radical extreme platform. There was no talk about land rights, no talk about refugee rights, no talk about...
I mean, individual candidates were talking about those things, right?
Sorry, I shouldn't overgeneralise.
As in, I feel like, both you and I were most involved with Rima Naji's campaign.
And Rima was talking a lot about Palestine and got a swing towards her.
Yes.
And huge swings towards her in the south.
So when you're talking about this, you're kind of talking more about, like,
the headline messages, the stuff that Adam Bandt was saying in the media, etc.
The sort of big campaign strategy approach rather than the actual on the ground, you know.
And I should note as well that Hung Trung, who ran down in the Victorian electorate of Fraser, also got a big swing towards her, like a 5% swing in a sort of migrant working class part of it. So, there's definitely a divergence happening where upper middle class people who perhaps have more to gain from maintaining the status quo, they're interested in slight progressive reforms.
Yes.
They've turned away from the Greens, but people who are perhaps a little more screwed over or oppressed by the system are turning towards the Greens.
One other really interesting dynamic to draw out, this is a very technocratic one, I guess, but courtesy of our good friend Andy Payne from Paradigm Shift, is, I guess, some detail about the changing electoral boundaries in Melbourne and the impact that that has had on Adam Band, who, as you just mentioned, has now lost his seat.
Yeah, so part of what happens every few years is electoral boundaries are redrawn to keep the voting populations of each electorate roughly similar. And there was quite significant boundary redrawings in Melbourne, which the Greens were excited about because some parts of Bant's electorate of Melbourne were going into the neighbouring electorate of Wills. So a bunch of people who'd already been voting Greens for Adam were now going to be in Samantha Ratnam's seat, which was going to make it easier to win the seat of Wills. And it does seem like Samantha has gotten a bit of an increase in her vote, but actually Adam lost some of the more progressive parts of his electorate and picked up suburbs like Prahran, which are not quite as strong for the Greens. So, yeah, it's probably good to remember that maybe part of the reason there was a bit of a swing against Adam was just that the boundaries were changed. So people were still voting Greens. It's just they were now in a different electorate.
Absolutely. And this is always a conversation worth having here in so-called Queensland, because the history of gerrymandering is so central to the history of Queensland politics, right? For those who don't know the term, gerrymandering just describes the kind of strategic drawing of electoral boundaries in ways that benefit particular political parties. And it is a long-standing part of the quote-unquote democratic process pretty much everywhere.
Which makes me think, actually, just real quick, about the fact that in Brisbane, we had, say, in the electorate of Moreton, swings against the Greens in the north of the electorate and big swings to the Greens in the south. And then in the next electorate just down of Rankin, there were also some booths that saw quite strong swings to the Greens, while others had, didn't do as well for the Greens. So where you draw the boundaries can have a big impact on what the results are. And so, yeah, like similarly for Max Chandler-Mather in Griffith, like the western end of the electorate of like West End still voted for Max very, very strongly. I think his primary vote was still almost 50% at West End State School. And the Greens vote in Annerley and some of the booths immediately to the south of his electorate boundary was also pretty good. So if Bulimba Heights wasn't in his electorate, but Annerley was, maybe Max would have still held on. So, yeah, the drawing of boundaries, we don't pay much attention to it these days, but it can have a big impact on the results in individual seats because different communities have different priorities, different experiences of state oppression, et cetera, and the boundaries don't really reflect that. And this is one of the reasons so many people call for proportional voting, which is kind of what we have in the Senate, because in the lower house, whoever wins like 51% of the seats gets like 100% of the power. And within a seat, you can have a situation, or like we do have this situation now in Queensland where in Australia actually, where Labor only won 30% of the primary vote, but has like way more than half the seats. Whereas the Greens have like a primary vote greater than 10%, like 12, 13% primary vote, but will only have one seat in the parliament.
Hopefully.
So, yeah. Interesting.
The work that Uncle Coco Wayne Wharton has been doing with his candidacy as lead Senate candidate for the Indigenous Aboriginal Party of Australia, that this granted Senate voting is quite different to lower house voting, so obviously I'm not conflating the two directly, but it is really significant that if you look at the distribution of votes in Aboriginal communities, which are often smack bang in the middle of incredibly conservative electorates, right? If you're thinking about places like Warrabinda, Cherbourg, these are all caught in electorates that are often enormous, geographically enormous, because they're rural electorates, and so they're often LNP electorates, often held by National Party members who deeply do not represent the interests of the Aboriginal communities within those electorates. But those areas were often seeing really high primary votes in the Senate, at least, for the Indigenous Party. And so I think there's some kind of interesting questions there too, again, in terms of proportional representation. And so, yeah, really like some interesting things to dig into there if you're an enormous nerd. So
it looks like in Queensland, the Indigenous Aboriginal Party of Australia, their lead Senate candidate, got 28,900 votes. So if all of those people had been in one lower house federal electorate, that would have almost been enough for them to win a seat. But obviously those voters are spread all around the state, and so that's never enough to get over the line in one place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is something this is a bit of a side point. I won't labour it too much, but it is something that's really interesting in terms of, reflecting back on this question of appealing to a real or imagined mainstream or quote-unquote centre, because I think this is something that does end up being somewhat inevitable when you have a democratic system that functions in the way that this one does, where it is not proportional and there's not a lot of space for, for instance, again, in comparison in Aotearoa, not to romanticise the democratic system there, but they do have like Māori-specific
they
seats.
have a Maori list. So, certain seats are allocated specifically for Indigenous candidates. And,
So, I mean, those kinds of things there, certainly there's still examples of reforms within, a colonial establishment. But they do mean that there are like there is more material representation of Māori interests in Aotearoa in Parliament,
Well, and I've talked about this previously, but they also have just a more proportional, sort of a mixed member proportional voting system in general, which means that it's possible for parties like the Greens to win more seats without necessarily getting 51% of the primary vote in a specific seat or 51% of the two-party preferred vote. And so what that means is that Greens candidates or Maori Party candidates can be a little more staunch and unapologetic in arguing for what they really want to argue for without having to water down their message, because they're not trying to get that 51% threshold. They can, if you can win some seats with 20% of the vote, then you can speak for or on behalf of those 20% of the population and be true to your principles and not have to compromise your message quite as much.
Yes.
And
I think this reflects, what we've talked about before in terms of the kind of limits of electoralism in the form that we experience it here in so-called Australia, one of which is that it is exceptionally difficult to avoid it becoming quite conservatizing in the sense that because there is this sort of general principle that you have to appeal to an imagined centre, you have to appeal to or convince a bunch of people that, your message is the most legitimate one, even though sometimes that requires you saying almost diametrically opposing things to different people in the constituency.
And that's also why campaign comms always seem so lowest common denominator in terms of creativity and style.
So conservative,
because you're just picking like the most non-threatening, neutral branding that's not going to scare off anyone. Rather than like a flyer that's got like someone with a megaphone at a protest looking like they're a radical, because, some people really want that system change message, but other people will be turned off by it. So you end up just with the candidate in a sort of suit jacket smiling at the camera like always. And
and I think this is something that's really worth that's worth really thinking about, because I know a line that I repeat from you often, Jono, from your experience working as a city councillor, is the kind of the challenge of this idea of like working within the institutions in order to work towards transformation. And the line that you've often used is like, well, change from within does work, but the thing that gets changed is you. And I think that there's something really important in thinking about that in terms of the way that the concessions that people as organisers make during election campaigns in order to be perceived as legitimate or rational or palatable.
I think there are still openings and value in contesting elections and pushing for change via parliamentary politics alongside stuff on the streets. But the lesson I think where you and I are both taking from this is that you can't, as you said, outperform a smear campaign that's so asymmetrical. I think
what I mean by that is that if the terms on which we understand our own success is winning seats, that is a thing that is going to be, that the odds of winning seats is stacked against us, right? I guess the point I think is significant is that I think deep political transformation is slower than winning seats, winning or losing seats. And I'm not saying that those things are not significant. I think the resourcing capacity that comes with having seats is really significant. I think the media reach is important. I don't think that I think it's naive to imply that these are not like important sites of power. But I do think that there is something dangerous about acquiescing to the idea of these victories or defeats as organised on the terms of, like, you know, did you win seats in Parliament or not? Our wonderful comrade Jamal Nabulsi talks about this moment that we're in, and particularly the way that Israel has exposed that we are in the death throes of settler colonialism, and the settler colonies know it, right? They know, like, the political establishment understands that the contradictions of colonisation are so severe, they're so close to the surface that they're constantly rupturing through, right? We are in a time of polycrisis. Everything is crumbling, and the sustaining discourses of liberal colonialism are beginning to fail. And so I think when you see the increasing proximity of the Labor and the Liberal Party, you know, the two mainstream dominant political parties that have historically been understood as diametrically opposed, the fact that their interests have largely converged now, that they are largely arguing on the same terms, is really significant to understanding that what is happening here is that people are terrified of the reality that the majority of the world's population are recognising that settler colonialism will fall. You know, that colonies will fall. They will begin to fail. They cannot keep sustaining themselves under the weight of these, of their own contradictions. And so I think that there is something really useful about seeing this as a moment where those of us who've been conscripted into the idea of, you know, settler colonial racial capitalism as inevitable, as inescapable, as, you know, the air we breathe, being convinced by the promise of reforming the settler colonial project. Yeah. And the people who do not have those same investments in being like, you can't reform a colony.
I did just want to note that, like, that same thing that the Greens experienced, where, like, candidates did all the things that the mainstream establishment says candidates should do, and then still calls them extreme. The same thing happened down in Goldstein to the Teal independent Zoe Daniel, who, like, in an election where otherwise the Liberals lost a lot of votes generally and had a really bad night, they've won back the seat of Goldstein off this independent. I'm assuming on the basis of a pretty aggressive smear campaign. So it's like, even when these independents who, they're so centrist, like Zoe Daniel is not at all challenging colonial capitalism. She's not even talking about stuff like renters' rights or whatever.
Yeah.
But even she couldn't hold her seat against a well-resourced and concerted major party attack campaign.
One thing I did want to flag is the election is never separate from the political dynamics happening more broadly, right? And yes. I at the moment am working for a university, and particularly working in a research institute that has been facing a huge amount of Zionist pushback, and the kind of direct impact of Zionist lobbying around academic freedom of speech, basically, and freedom of political expression. And what's been really interesting is watching pretty much the same playbook of responses are being operationalised against academics, right? So most acutely against Palestinian academics. We've watched Dr. Randa Abdel Fattah now copping multiple years, just in this most recent wave of anti-Palestinian racism, copping years now of direct lobbying to try and get her fired, to try and get her government funding removed. She's currently undergoing an audit of her Australian Research Council funding, which is, as far as I know, an unprecedented experience for someone on the basis of her political views. But this is also happening increasingly to First Nations academics who are facing, again, these same discourses of extremism that are uncontestable. And I think this is what's most interesting, right, is that I think a lot of us are stuck at the moment because we keep trying to outperform a completely unhinged from reality discourse of extremism.
I mean, even I right now am the subject of human rights complaints because I dared to say Zionism isn't very good.
Yes.
You know, like,
absolutely right. And I think there's something really significant in this particular moment about saying the truth cannot transcend power. And I guess that's the thing that I come back to consistently, because it's the sort of sustaining fantasy is that if we just tell people the truth, if we just show people how things really are, then the established power structures will have to crumble. And over again, we see that that's not in fact the case.
I want to be more hopeful and less cynical than that. But I think what you're gesturing to is that it's truth as spoken by atomised individuals who are easily picked off will not triumph. But collectively organised truth by, thousands of people hitting the streets or engaging in other forms of direct action.
Right? Then that's power.
Sure, yeah.
And, power can transcend power.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just wanted to jump very quickly into just a couple of comments.
Let's see them.
Yeah, Wonderful Han has messaged in just to note that Muslim Votes Matters were obviously doing some really interesting work in the outer suburbs and around the particular swing towards people like Rima, but other candidates as well.
Yeah, it was great to see but I think those swings came from people talking to each other rather than like institutions talking to each other. Perhaps that's too. We don't really know.
No, we don't really know. But I think an interesting reminder of the different ways people have been mobilising in this election. They also write just in appreciation of seeing this kind of analysis. They say so much of voting in this settler colony strikes me as a vote against rather than any votes for, despite Labor's claims that this is a major endorsement of the Albanese government and everything it's been doing.
They got 1/3 of the vote. That's not a major endorsement. Yeah.
And it's clear, they say, folks didn't want Dutton Trumpism here, but the fact that Labor was polling so badly up to weeks out doesn't exactly scream meaningful endorsement or even satisfaction with the current leadership, right?
Well said, Han.
Anita also notes that Dutton now gets a pension of $280,000 a year, which is...
Is that still a thing? I've got to fact check that. I thought they got rid of parliamentary pensions. Damn.
Stacey asks, but does engaging with the political establishment not reify the settler colonial state? Is there an implication here that the Greens are critical of settler colonial racial capitalism? I think the opposite remains true, plain and simply as a political party. And they continue, if you want to undermine settler capitalism, don't take their money. Their institutions are colonial. Their money is colonial. We need to stop saying that we don't want to tear their world down. We do. Which I think, and I think this is like a huge part of the conversation we've been having for years, right?
Can I just jump in? Yeah. They're right about Dutton because the parliamentary pension scheme has been scrapped. So like Max Chandler-Mather, Stephen Bates, those newer Greens MPs, they won't get that parliamentary pension. But Dutton has been in politics so long that he's still eligible for that $258,000 parliament. God, I thought that was scrapped decades ago, but he's been there for that long.
Incredible.
Gross.
Thank you so much, Stacey, for that last point. And I think it's one that, we have obviously, long-term listeners will know this is something we've been wrestling with for years. And I think that I think it's it's really important to be thinking about. I guess the position that I often come to on this is that for me, and this is because I am located here as a settler, my very being on this continent is active complicity and continuing colonisation. Like, that's not a thing that I am able to kind of extricate myself from, which is not to say that there, nothing else can be done, but I think it is worth... for those of us who are settlers, maybe thinking more deeply about complicity, not necessarily just as something that happens if you opt into participation in particular ways, and that is also perhaps impossible to opt out of in and of itself, but which then does mean that a kind of more active wrestling with like harm minimisation. How do you how do you think, I guess, more strategically about the possibilities of undermining these systems? I'm sceptical of the idea that refusing to participate in and of itself dismantles these systems.
I don't think it does at all.
I think it does en masse. This is a challenge, but how do you convince people en masse to to disengage from these systems? Anyway,
big conversation there.
Would love to continue that conversation, Stacey. It's obviously something, we think about all the time. So we are kind of running out of time on this week's episode, but one of the things we did want to, I guess, really emphasise in a show about elections, which is a thing that we continue to cover because although, at least in my case, it's not my favourite sphere of political life,
sure,
I do think that there are really important political lessons to be learnt from paying attention to elections. Partly about the limits of electoralism as a total strategy, which is something you and I have been talking about together for years, but also in terms of what it leads us to next?
Yeah.
And I guess this is something that we've talked about for a long time in the framework of kind of an ecology of the left, which is just a fancy phrase for describing this idea that people are going to be working on a whole bunch of different kinds of projects in a whole bunch of different kinds of places. But it is useful to think about how those projects can be shaped so that they are in support of a kind of broader, commitment to collective liberation, rather than operating in opposition to one another, so that you end up in these situations where people who are doing more, more radical, more kind of anti-statist work consider folks who are doing more kind of electoral organising, even if it's quite radical electoral organising, consider them to be kind of, the enemy.
Yeah. And I think we're all our most powerful when those lines are really blurred. Like, I think about my time as a city councillor, where it was sometimes hard for people to discern where do the Greens as a political party stop and where do the community movements start. There was a lot of overlap in terms of the kinds of organising my office was doing and the local Greens branch and that sort of stuff. Whereas once those lines become starker and some people are very clearly electorally focused and some people are very clearly direct action focused, then those wings of the movement aren't talking to each other enough. But it's I think, valuable to remember that one of the reasons the Greens started as a political party to begin with was that there were all these activists doing different kinds of land rights campaigning, anti-nuclear campaigning, sustainable development campaigning, all these different struggles. And they were like, oh, we're all doing this grassroots, bottom-up community work, but it would be really, really helpful to have some allies within the parliament. So we need a political party to be a sort of electoral wing of the broader social movement. So, we've gotten to this point where there is a Greens party and there are people engaging with electoralism because a previous generation of activists thought a lot about it, learned from their own experiences, and recognised that was a gap. And so I guess I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the potential and the importance of engaging with these systems strategically, because, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, this is a conversation for another show, but it is one that we've had many times before on Radio Reversal in our traditional post-election show, which is that, I guess, the challenge is that electoralism as a strategy, including for some people in the Greens, does sometimes have a tendency to cannibalise other movements. And I think there is a tendency among some people who get really invested in electoral organising to position it as the only important work to do and the only site of quote-unquote real political change.
Yeah.
And I think that does need to be named
and
as a very real dynamic, right? And I think
I saw that play out on the ground, right? Like in the final weeks of campaigning, there was anti-eviction action that I ended up sort of helping organise, where a couple of disability pensioners out in Runcorn were getting evicted, and it would have been great to have more people on the ground, to have a larger number of volunteers who could rock up to that house and help resist the police enforcing that warrant of possession. But a lot of volunteers who might have been able to come out on a weekday morning were instead at the early voting booths handing out flyers. Like, if you added it up across all the pre-polling booths in Brisbane, there would have been upwards of 100 Greens volunteers, I reckon, who were rostered onto all those early voting booths. Maybe not upwards of about 100. But most of those people could have travelled to Runcorn to participate in this peaceful protest against an eviction. Instead, though, they were just handing out flyers at the polling booth. So that was a very direct... People had to make that choice, and people have limited capacity. But we still went ahead with the action, and it was really cool that Rima, who was a candidate and could also have been handing out flyers at the polling booth, instead said, I'm going to take a few hours off the booth, I'm going to head out to this action, and it was successful, and we stopped them getting evicted. And I think that's a really powerful reminder that even when we don't yet hold a seat, we can leverage real community power from the bottom up.
Absolutely. And I think, this is something we talked about a little bit in earlier shows as part of this series on crisis and disaster. But I think that example, is instrumental, because one of the things that we have seen here in so-called Brisbane, I guess, where we're talking a lot about the Greens because it's connections that we have, obviously, directly, but also, we do live in what used to be a green seat.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a really interesting example there when we're thinking about crisis and disaster, and I guess what what crises are deemed urgent and immediate enough for people to kind of drop everything and redirect towards those, and what are not. And I guess that's a good example of the fact that, when we saw Cyclone Alfred earlier in the year, there was a massive redirection of electoral organising energy towards, on the ground direct support for residents who were experiencing flooding or impacts from the cyclone. Whereas eviction defences 2 weeks out from the election, although still a crisis, is not is only certain candidates are going to redirect their energies towards that, right?
And that's partly because about what actions are seen as likely to win votes.
Yes.
It's partly about the fact that it is just harder and more stressful to do direct action where people are potentially breaking the law, and that's not something that everyone can safely participate in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this kind of leads us into the I guess the final example maybe that we wanted to leave on this week's show, which is also connected to, I think, some of the reasons that the discourse of this federal election as a progressive defeat of Dutton's repressive policies feels so hollow, is because here in Queensland we are 6 months into an LNP government that won in a landslide election in October of last year on a platform that was horrifically repressive, right? Adult crime, adult time was the centrepiece of the LNP's election campaign. Those of you who are based in Meganjin will remember the billboards, but you'll also remember the mainstream media's active complicity in manufacturing this discourse of a youth crime crisis, this discourse of a law and order emergency, which has already operated. The adult crime, adult time has been implemented now in Queensland. So those laws were passed by the Parliament last year with only Greens opposition. So the Labor Party in Queensland voted in support of that legislation. We know it overrides the human rights of young people and of criminalised young people in Queensland, because the Human Rights Commission has notified the government that their laws are
very clear,
in breach of the Human Rights Act twice. And then at the council level, where we also have a hostile LNP council, right now in Musgrave Park, we are watching folks who are sleeping rough as a direct consequence of both the long-standing colonial housing crisis of the dispossession of Aboriginal people from their land and its most acute contemporary version of the capitalist housing crisis where people can't afford to live anywhere.
And the Labor government stubbornly refusing to build public housing and strengthen renters' rights.
We are seeing now, right on the ground, people who have been sleeping rough in Musgrave Park being forcibly removed by the council with the support of the Queensland Police, being evicted from the park, having their belongings destroyed in many cases, with no alternative for where they're meant to go. So, I think there's...
And we've just voted in the federal Labor government that created that crisis in a way, or perpetuated it.
Absolutely.
The federal Labor government did nothing significant about the housing crisis, and now people on the ground are being chased out of a park.
Yes, and I think the popular narrative is that is happening, because, the LNP, they're so much worse. But I think this is also, as I said, the ALP in Queensland voted in favour of adult crime, adult time legislation. We've seen little to no opposition from Labor in the Labor members in the City Council to the removal of people from parks.
Or state MPs for that matter. Like South Brisbane now has a Labor state MP, and in her electorate, the local police, who she has a relationship with, are going in to chase homeless people out of the park.
To evict homeless people out.
And I don't see the state member of Parliament for South Brisbane criticising the police or speaking out about that
Absolutely.
situation.
Shout out to Trina Massey, who's the Greens councillor for the Gabba ward, who has been on the ground and is doing her best, I believe, to keep residents updated and support the folks who are being moved on. But I think it's useful to keep in mind that the real work is and has always been in the communities who are actively supporting one another in the kind of acute experiences of the crisis. And we're really grateful. We're going to have a quick chat to one of the organisers from the Community Union Defence League, CUDL, as it is colloquially known, who've been running community dinners, community meetings, and a whole bunch of excellent mutual aid projects down at Musgrave Park for the last couple of months, and who have been on site for the last few days supporting folks who are facing eviction. This is not a problem that's going away. You're listening to Radio Reversal. I'm Anna. I'm in the studio with Jono, and we're on the line with Beck, who's down at Musgrave Park at the moment.
Beck, do you want to tell us a little bit about what's been happening in Musgrave Park this morning and what the latest is?
Yep, so we are currently at Musgrave Park. This morning, cops, Department of Housing and council workers showed up at 6 a.m. They shook everybody's tents, woke everybody up and told them they had 30 minutes to leave the park. This involved taking all of their belongings with them. We were lucky enough that we had a big group of people present so that we could observe what happened and help people pack up their belongings and move them to a safe place while we search for ongoing storage for them. But yeah, so we've done that. People were threatened with obstruction orders if they didn't get out of the way of the cops. People were told that they would be given move-on orders if they didn't let the cops harass these people. So yeah, we're currently trying to support these rough sleepers today at the barbecue shelter while we figure out an option for them moving forward.
So this is a continuation of the Lord Mayor's ongoing crackdown on people sleeping in tents, but it's kind of escalated because they now want to fence off the entirety of Musgrave Park for the Panegyri Festival. And I'm right in saying that the festival is only a 2-day festival, but they're fencing off Musgrave Park for like 2 weeks either side of it. And I think you told me that none of these rough sleepers have actually been offered stable, safe accommodation anywhere. Is that right?
That's correct. So this morning, as they came through, they were asking people if they wanted to engage in support from the Department of Housing. Obviously, everybody said yes, but there was actually nothing lined up for them. At this current time, the information that I have is that one person was offered one night somewhere. It may have been a hotel, but it was a bit vague. And one person has been offered a spot at Roma House.
Which has a reputation for being pretty unsafe and not very nice to be in.
Yes, and he has been there before and was very anxious about having to go back. But other than that, nobody else that I'm aware of at present has been offered even like a couple of days somewhere. They've been told that if they want help, they're welcome to engage.
That's crazy, isn't it? Where the government says, yes, we've offered them support, but actually the support is nothing. So
yes.
What would you still like people to get down to Musgrave Park and help out throughout the day?
Yeah, so we are currently keeping an eye on people's belongings while they try and negotiate through the so-called appropriate channels. We have people who are like all over the city at the moment trying to get help and trying to find accommodation. So if people could come down to Musgrave Park, we're at the barbecue shelter on the Cordelia Street side of the park. We're just looking after people's things. We've got a barbecue set up. We've got some food. We've got tea and coffee. Just general support of the community would be really appreciated right now. And we are currently organising a plan to help support anybody else who remains in the park tomorrow morning as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Beck. So Beck's connected to the Community Union Defence League, which is a good way to stay in touch with what's going on. But if you're in the neighbourhood, get down to Musgrave Park and connect with people on the ground. Hey, thanks for the great work you're doing, Beck. Any final words?
Yeah, just, we're better than this. Brisbane is better than this. And obviously the government is failing us. So all that's left is the community.
Well said.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for helping.
Thanks, Beck. See you later.
Thanks. See ya. Bye.
And a huge shout out just to everyone who has been doing this work so tirelessly in support of folks in Musgrave Park for the last couple of months. I think it's a really important reminder in this kind of show, particularly where, as Stacey pointed out, our gaze in this show is very firmly on, the political establishment and making sense of these dynamics that are operating at that scale. But the real work, and certainly my real interest, is in the work that people are doing to support each other, to kind of build community infrastructures, to find ways to kind of build up our collective capacity to not be reliant on the settler colonial institutions that currently shape so much of our lives. So I think there's a lot of work to do, and I think sometimes, to throw back to Chelsea's commentary again, get caught in this sort of binary of hope and despair as though these are the only two available options. And I think what it makes me think about is just what we're being hopeful about and where our hope lies. And
to tie it back to electoral strategies just a little bit, I think it is worth noting and emphasising that some politicians, I shout out to Lydia Thorpe, for example, but also like Jenny Leong, the Greens MP for Newtown in the New South Wales State Parliament. There are examples of MPs who use their position to support activism and are more deeply enmeshed in grassroots organising and struggle on the street.
Even shout out to Uncle Coco Wayne Wharton, who ran as the lead Senate candidate here in so-called Queensland for the Indigenous Aboriginal Party, a new political formation. And early reports are that they're polling incredibly powerfully in Aboriginal communities, and I think offering, again, another reminder of the different ways people are kind of strategizing and operationalizing collective community power and navigating elections in different ways, right?
Well
there's
said.
so much possibility and there's so much work to do. So much possibility indeed. You have been listening to the Radio Reversal podcast. It's another episode done.
Hooray! Thanks for listening, everyone.
We've, of course, left a lot of tantalising threads here unpulled, but never fear, we will be tugging on them for... For many weeks yet.
Get ready for some tugging.
We've got lots more episodes in this particular series on crisis and disaster and the sort of struggle for collective futures, including some great conversations about the history of labour organising during times of crisis, and some conversations about the sort of quote-unquote gender crisis being operationalised by right-wing figures across the world and tacitly accepted by, centrists across the globe, and the sort of persecution of trans folks that we're seeing in this moment, and the long history of trans resistance organising leading the way in the struggle for more liberatory futures for all of us. So there's heaps to go.
Can't wait.
Please do let us know if there's anything you'd like us to have a chat about, if there's anything you think we missed, if you think we got it all wrong, please do get in touch. You can subscribe to our Substack, send us a message there, find us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. I'm Anna. I've been on the airwaves this morning with Jono.
Thanks for listening, everyone. See you next time.